This simple, iconic bridge serves as a gateway to our story, a story of the fight for freedom and the unsung heroes, patriots of color who played a vital role. On April 19, 1775, the shot heard around the world was fired right here at this bridge. The bridge that stood then was already 15 years old, having been built in 1760 through the labor of both local townspeople and the enslaved individuals whose stolen labor helped to build it. Records show that Nathan and Timothy Billings were paid for several days of labor by their man, by some of it in the water. That service has actually been performed by men enslaved to them, and the pay was given to the Billings. When I place my hands on the rails of this bridge and think of the hands that built it, I'm reminded that this nation was forged through the labors and sacrifice of all people, free and enslaved. Revolutionary New England was a slave-holding society. Slavery and racism were integral parts of colonial American society, relegating people of color to the lowest social class. While the powerful were able to exert control over others, especially the enslaved, those at the bottoms of the social order were forced into dependency, making life outside of established institutions incredibly difficult. Slavery formed the backbone of the Massachusetts economy. From their tableware to their rum, to the enslaved they held in bondage, the wealth and commodities of the slave trade touched every person in Concord. By 1775, over 10% of Boston's population were people of color. Revolutionary Concord in New England itself was a diverse society filled with Black, Indigenous, and mixed-race men and women, and children both free and enslaved. Massachusetts had actually been the first colony to authorize legal enslavement in 1641, so by the time of the battle here at Concord in 1775, the region's economy was deeply tied to enslavement. The sugar and the rum on their table, enslaved colonists held under bondage in their homes, was a contradiction not lost on many at the time. In 1773, just a few years before the outbreak of the Revolution, a black man named John Jack was buried here in the far back of the Old Hill Cemetery. John had been kidnapped from Africa and spent most of his life enslaved to a local family. Over time, however, he was able to purchase his freedom, becoming one of the first black landowners in the community. But upon his death, a twist of irony unfolded. His lawyer, a man loyal to England, used John's gravestone as a stark reminder to the local patriots. In an era when cries for liberty were swelling, the lawyer sought to highlight the hypocrisy of calling for freedom from king and parliament while simultaneously holding others in bondage.
God wills us free. Man wills us slaves. I will as God wills. God's will be done. Here lies the body of John Jack, a native of Africa who died March 1773, aged about 60 years. Though born in a land of slavery, he was born free. Though he lived in a land of liberty, he lived a slave, till by his honest though stolen labors he acquired the source of slavery, which gave him his freedom. Though not long before death, the grand tyrant gave him his final emancipation and set him on a footing with kings. Though a slave to vice, he practiced those virtues without which kings are but slaves.
Men and women of color were also quite aware of this hypocrisy in a series of petitions that were created in the years surrounding the outbreak of the war. In the early 1770s, groups of Massachusetts enslaved people and freemen petitioned the colonial government, claiming that freedom was a right belonging to all men and women.
The humble petition of many slaves. How many of that number have been there and are now in this province, who have had every day of their lives embittered with this most intolerable reflection, that neither they nor their children of all generations shall ever be able to do, or to possess and enjoy anything. No, not even life itself, but in a manner as the beasts that perish. We have no property, we have no wives, no children, we have no city, no country. We humbly begged leave to add but this one thing. To us will be as life from the dead. Signed, Felix.
The petitions, although powerful in words, were not taken up by the authorities, and enslavement continued.
By the morning of April 19th, as the alarm bells rang out calling men to muster, we know that men of color were among those who answered the call. While they had initially been excluded from regular training, when the general alarm sounded, all able-bodied men were expected to join the ranks, and many men of color did just that. Current estimates now show that between 40 and 60 Patriots of Color served during the fateful day, April 19, 1775. As the provincial militia grew in the months that followed, men of color became an integral part of its ranks. This made it not only America's first fighting force, but the most diverse military unit in the nation's history, maintaining that distinction until the mid-20th century. The motivations of these Patriots of Color were complex. For some, the revolution represented a chance to secure freedom, not just for themselves, but for future generations. Their reasons for joining were shaped by a mix of personal survival, the hope for freedom, loyalty to the ideals of liberty and equality, and in some cases, economic survival. Many fought in the Revolutionary War with the hope that it would create a better future for their families and descendants. Some had no choice. Their white enslavers sent them to war to claim enlistment bounties for themselves. However, many black men seized the opportunity to join in the exchange for the promise of freedom, while others escaped captivity altogether, viewing military service as a personal declaration of freedom, often marking this new chapter by changing their names. By the summer of 1775, George Washington had assumed command of the Continental Army. After initially dismissing soldiers of African descent, Washington faced strong protests from both white officers and black soldiers in New England. Eventually, he reversed his decision and reopened military service to men of color. By the end of 1776, black soldiers in New England had become an integral part of racially integrated regiments. Regardless of the reasons they enlisted, these patriots demonstrated extraordinary loyalty to the cause of independence, yet their contributions have rarely been given the recognition they deserve. In total, thousands of free and enslaved black and indigenous people served in the Continental Army by the war's end, in an essential but often overlooked chapter in the story of American independence.
Historically, the Mohican, Housatonic, Wappinger, and Tungus people called themselves Mohicanock, or people of the waters that are never still. Dozens of Stockbridge warriors rushed east to Cambridge after receiving the alarm of April 19, 1775. Reverend William Emerson mentioned in his journal that the Stockbridge fighters shared clams with him while amongst their wigwams during the siege of Boston. Others noted Stockbridge bravery as warriors engaged in independent skirmishes against the King's troops near Charlestown. British sentries were routinely harassed and killed by Stockbridge warriors in 1775, and a shower of their arrows killed a British sailor, thwarting an attempt to move British military supplies along the Charles River. The Stockbridge Mohican lost prominent warriors at Bunker Hill and went on to fight in most of the northern battles of the American Revolution. Significant numbers of Stockbridge fighters were killed in battle or by disease. After the war, Stockbridge widows and families found themselves further displaced from their homelands, this time by Americans. Their only thanks, a document from George Washington and an ox to slaughter for a feast. Subsequently, the Stockbridge Mohican were left to seek refuge with the Oneida Nation in New York State, and eventually both nations were forced out of New York to Wisconsin. Shawano County, Wisconsin is where the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians continue today.
Philip Barrett, born about 1760, was enslaved by Colonel James Barrett. On April 19, 1775, it is likely he aided in the removal of military supplies from Barrett's farm before the arrival of British regulars. When James Barrett died in 1779, his will stipulated that his son inherit Philip and that he remain enslaved until Philip turned 30. Philip enlisted in the Continental Army in 1780 and was soon stationed at West Point. There is no record of what became of Philip following his military service. Many in Concord believe he took his freedom. The town never saw him again. Thomas Nichols was a free man of color married to a person of indigenous descent. On the morning of April 19th, he was locked in the Concord jail. A paper breathlessly reported that,
"By a gentleman arrived here from Boston, we are informed that last week a free Negro was apprehended at Natick in Massachusetts Bay government and, after examination, committed to Concord jail. It appeared that said fellow has for some time past been employed in forming a plot to destroy the white people. For that purpose, he had enlisted numbers of his own complexion as associates, and they only waited until some disturbance should happen that might occasion the militia to turn out, and in their absence, it was proposed to murder the defenseless inhabitants."
Nichols was still in Concord's jail when the Revolutionary War broke out. He witnessed British troops under Major John Pitcairn force their way into the jail yard. Interestingly, later that day, more than one of his cousins was fighting with the Patriot forces along Battle Road. This family story is a striking example of the complex and often contradictory experiences of people of color at the outbreak of the war. As we see with Thomas Nichols, the fear of slave rebellion was a significant concern. The American Revolution, with its call for liberty, freedom, and equality, posed a paradox for slave-owning colonists. This contradiction fueled anxiety among enslavers as they feared that the rhetoric of liberty could inspire enslaved people to demand their own freedom.
Brister Freeman, born in 1744, who had been given as a wedding gift to Dr. John Cumming between the ages of 5 and 9, lived in captivity for the first 30 years or so of his life until he gained his freedom after fighting in the Revolutionary War. During his service, Brister marched under Colonel John Buttrick to Saratoga in 1777 and watched British General Burgoyne surrender. 2 years later, after being documented with the name Brister Cumming, he enlisted under the name Brister Freeman, announcing his newly acquired freedom. In his later life, Brister purchased an acre of old woodlot in Walden Woods with Charleston Eddies, a fellow African-American Revolutionary War soldier, and set up a two-family household. He was the second man of African descent to purchase Concord land. Other formerly enslaved people followed, and Walden Woods became one of 3 black enclaves that sprang up in Concord following gradual emancipation in Massachusetts. Walden Woods was home to as many as 15 formerly enslaved people and their families. Brister passed away in 1822, but his burial site is neither marked nor known. Today, the land is town forest and is stewarded by the Town of Concord. The ditch fence Brister dug around his property to keep animals enclosed is still visible to passers-by. In commemoration of his life, the Robbins house placed a boulder marking the Freeman family home site in 2011, and the site is also addressed by a nearby plaque. Enslaved at birth in nearby Chelmsford, Caesar Robbins served in 2 wars. At just 16 years old, he fought in the French and Indian War, with his enslaver receiving his payment. In his early 30s, on April 19, 1775, Caesar was enslaved at Captain Israel Heald of Acton, who mustered at the North Bridge. It's likely that Robbins fought alongside Heald's company that day. Caesar went on to serve in the Revolutionary War and, through his military service, earned his freedom. In 1776, at 31 years old, he fought under Captain Heald to help fortify Dorchester Heights in Boston. Later that summer, he marched to Fort Ticonderoga in New York. By 1779, Caesar enlisted for the last time. Records from 1784 show that at 40 years old, Caesar Robbins was a free man and the head of his own household. By 1790, he was farming on a small plot of land in Concord, which was owned by Humphrey Barrett. Over the years, Caesar married twice and had 6 children. He died in 1822, and the following year, his son Peter purchased over 13 acres of land, including the home that would become the Robbins house. In 1823, Caesar's children Peter and Susan became the first residents of the house. This is the Robbins house, Though Caesar Robbins passed away before it was completed, this 544 square foot house, built in the early 1820s, was originally located on a secluded farm overlooking the Great Meadows along the Concord River. The first two families to live here were descendants of Caesar Robbins, a Revolutionary War patriot. In 1823, Caesar's daughter Susan, her husband Jack Garrison, and their children moved into the east side of the house. Caesar's granddaughter, Ellen Garrison, continued the fight for freedom that her grandfather had begun in the American Revolution. As a child, Ellen attended Concord Public Schools, where she was the only black student in her class. In 1835, she marched in the town parade, enduring the gaze of curiosity, surprise, ridicule, and admiration from the townspeople. After graduating, Ellen dedicated her life to education, teaching formerly enslaved people how to grow and prosper as free men and women. In a letter from June 1863, Ellen explained her motivation.
I have a great desire to go and labor among the freed men of the South. I think it is our duty as a people to spend our lives trying to elevate our own race. Who can feel for us if we do not feel for ourselves? And who can feel the sympathy that we can, who are identified with them? My motto is educate, educate, educate.
Almost a century before Rosa Parks, Ellen became one of the first African Americans to challenge the legality of segregation under the Civil Rights Act of 1866. She and another black teacher were forcibly removed from a whites-only waiting room in a Baltimore train station. Undeterred, she brought a lawsuit against the railroad officials who assaulted her, testing the new Civil Rights Act passed just a month earlier. Ellen's legal challenge was a precursor to Rosa Parks' iconic stand in 1955. Ellen herself believed she was
striving to maintain my rights. It will be a stand for others.
In this way, Ellen Garrison became a true American patriot, fighting for the expansion of freedom and democracy. In the 1880s, Ellen moved to Kansas, where she taught exodusters, African Americans who had fled the South to escape racial violence. Later, for health reasons, she moved west to Pasadena, California, where she lived with her husband and sister. She passed away on December 21, 1892, at the age of 69, and was buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Altadena. In 2025, Ellen Garrison was honored as the first person of color in nearly 400 years to have a public building named after them in Concord, with the opening of the Ellen Garrison Building at Concord Middle School. Here we are back at the bridge. By 1788, the bridge, built in the 1760s with the labor of enslaved people and fought over in 1775, was worn down and needed repairs. The townspeople once again gathered to fix it, but this time, two men, Caesar Robbins and Brister Freeman, were among those working on the project. These men, who had once been enslaved, were now free. They were paid for their work, and their money they earned was their own. This shift was part of a larger change in post-revolutionary Massachusetts, where formerly enslaved people were beginning to experience more freedom and independence. The bridge's restoration wasn't just about fixing a structure, it reflected the larger process of repair taking place in some areas. Just as the bridge had worn down over time, the social fabric of Concord, scarred by slavery, was changing. The fact that Robbins and Freeman were now paid for their labor symbolized a small but important step toward greater freedom and equality. In this way, the bridge became a powerful reminder of the nation's ongoing work ahead to address the injustices of enslavement everywhere. Although the contributions of Patriots of Color were recognized and in some cases honored during their time and documented in the 19th century, their stories have often been erased or overshadowed by historical bias and systemic racism. Despite their vital roles in the founding of our nation, these patriots were largely overlooked in the decades following the Revolution, their sacrifices obscured by a narrative written by others. By telling their stories and honoring their service, we not only shed light on their essential contributions, but also expand our understanding of the nation's founding. Their bravery and resilience remind us that the struggle for freedom has always been fought by people from all backgrounds and walks of life. Today, efforts at the national and state levels, particularly in Massachusetts, are working to correct this historical oversight and honor the full spectrum of those who fought and continue to fight for liberty and equality for all people. While the American Revolution marked a turning point in the fight for freedom, the struggle for equality did not end there. It continues today, shaped by the same ideals of justice and liberty that were championed by Patriots of Color. The more we learn about their stories and the full stories of all Americans, the stronger our nation becomes. As we move forward, we each have the power to seek out and share these untold stories in our own communities, to honor the past and celebrate the contributions of all. By working together, we can ensure that the next 250 years of American freedom are truly extraordinary.